Hello, everyone. Welcome to this commemoration organized by Voices for a World Free of Nuclear Weapons. My name is Kehkashan. I am the lead of the Voices youth team and founder president of Green Hope Foundation. And I am honored to be moderating today's discussion, which honors a legend. Now, we are gathered here today to celebrate the life and legacy of the Honorable George Shultz. If one ever wondered what the word Colossus represented, then Secretary Shultz embodied it in the best way possible. A rich and impactful life that spanned a century at the helm of affairs of the world's most powerful country in an era that witnessed transformation, progress, and adversity in complex dimensions. His life story is indeed one that could make the script of a spellbinder. His obituary on the Boston Globe proclaimed him as an environmentalist and technologist ahead of his time. And this was indeed a testament to his multifacetedness, wherein it was not just his foreign policy experience, but also his role as a visionary problem solver in the interrelated issues of climate change, nuclear disarmament, and technology that set him apart on the world stage. He once famously said, "He who walks in the middle of the road gets hit from both sides." And in his stellar career, he lived by this adage, never hesitating to stand up for what was just and for the greater good. I had the immense privilege of meeting him at the URI Accelerate Peace Conference at Stanford University in 2019, a memory that I will cherish forever. And I also bear the monumental responsibility of carrying forward his legacy of peace and disarmament as the first ever winner of the Voices Youth Award that was co-instituted in his name. In our program today, Voices for a World Free of Nuclear Weapons is privileged to have with us an extremely eminent panel of speakers and luminaries, each of whom engaged very closely with Secretary Shultz, and they will share their perspectives and anecdotes of this legendary persona. Before I give them the floor, we would like to show a short video.
My name is George Shultz, former Secretary of State under President Ronald Reagan, and this is my own prayer. Dear God, please bring common sense and divine guidance to our work on the problems that nuclear weapons pose to our world. Man has invented a means to destroy us all. We must eliminate these weapons in order to preserve a sane and peaceful world. We pray for your help as we work toward this goal. Bill made a statement a while ago that I've quoted quite a few times, and I think summarizes it well. He says, when you put your hand on the Bible and swear to be President of the United States, that's the least of it. It's when you put your hand on the nuclear button and you can press the button and set off a process that could kill 1 million people. You're not president anymore, you're God. We don't elect God. Where is it written that some human being should have the ability to press a button and kill 1 million people? That's not right. So proliferation is a problem, and I think it's one of the worrisome problems in the world. And it's one of the voices of URI. And I think it's very important to keep this flame of reducing nuclear weapons alive. And so it's very important to keep working at this, and Bill continues to work at it. in our URI cooperative circle here, that's one of the subjects we talk about. No, you haven't asked me anything about climate change.
Well, let's. That's
but
on my
this
that's
is
on my
a
list.
big issue.
Okay, so
I don't know what's the matter with your questioning.
It's right here, number 8. So, a climate insurance policy. Can you talk about that?
Well, I think first of all that the climate is getting warmer. I don't think there's any question about it. You have to ask, if you don't like the science, I respect the science, why is it there's a new ocean being created in the Arctic? How come? How come the ice cap over Greenland is melting fast? How come reefs, or all the Great Barrier Reef and the reefs in the Caribbean are all acidifying? Why is that happening? It's because the ocean is getting warmer. Why are the fish moving north? For the same reason. So obviously the climate is changing, and there are big potential impacts. That's my main message. Keep the flame burning. Let's find ourselves, get to a world free of nuclear weapons, and this tree reminds us of the importance of it. I want to say one more thing about the tree, though. Right now, we're also worried about climate change. And we know that the more trees there are, the better we do in fighting it. So the leaves from these trees stand for our joint effort to do everything we can to keep, I have a capture already, make the earth cool again. We need to keep working at it, and planting trees is a good way to work at it. Thank you. So there's just a little element of trust there. Trust is the coin of the realm. So that built, and I think it was part of the evolution of the relationship between two personal giants, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. And they could interact comfortably with each other because they trusted each other. They knew that the other one would do whatever they said they would do. So that was a big thing. I'm in my 100th year, but I feel like a promising young man.
Without any further delay, I would like to invite the Right Reverend William Swing to take the floor. Bishop Swing, yeah, let me spotlight you. And I would like to begin by asking you, when did you first meet Secretary Shultz? What did you think of that meeting? And really, how did your friendship begin?
Thank you, Kehkashan. Thank you for the wonderful video that just happened, a fitting tribute. George Shultz's mother came from missionary family out in Idaho. And when they died, she had to go someplace to live. So she went to New York, and he was raised in a religious family. And so he was an Episcopalian, a member of the Diocese of California, and I didn't know him. And his priest got him to give a speech, and I went to the speech, and we shook hands. And it's very interesting because I said, Secretary Shultz, let me tell you about the United Religions Initiative. And I told him about it, and he said, that doesn't sound like anything that's ever going to happen. I said, okay. So then I saw him a couple of months later, and he said, I've been thinking about that. And, there's something to it. That's got possibilities. I said, that's great. So then a couple months later, he came to me and he said, this is really important. I want to back this, and I want to work with you. So that was going on. And Secondly, he fell in love with Charlotte Shultz and she with him. And Charlotte's one of my best friends. And so she got George and me together on many, many occasions, and I performed their wedding. It was kind of interesting to do premarital counseling with George and Charlotte sitting on the other side of the room. A guy who helps ends the Cold War, and I'm sitting there. Anyway, married him, and George is a golfer. I'm a golfer. We spent a lot of time playing golf together, talking together. I was housing 1,600 homeless every night and feeding about 2 million people a day. And so I brought George along with me to the housing the homeless, and he was great. He got it. And our relationship just evolved, and he knew I was interested in nuclear disarmament. So he invited me down to Stanford once, and all the experts, the military, the Russian experts, the politicians, the scientists, they're all gathered around some table, and the rest of us are up in a balcony. And I'm wildly taking notes because I can't keep up with these people. They're so far ahead of me and know so much. And they speak, and I'm writing everything down. And then finally, George looks up at the balcony and he said, "Bill, what do you think?" I didn't know what I thought. I thought, I want to take notes. I want to listen. And he said, "No, Bill, what do you think?" And he drove me deeper into myself and demanded that I come up and link theological training, mystic experience with God, with nuclear weapons. And come on, what is it? And he continued to do that to me the rest of my life and his life. I remember one time I was sitting in his office with a bunch of his friends, and he said, "You know, the 25th anniversary of the death of Andrei Sakharov is coming up, and he needs to be honored." Of course, Sid Drell, the great physicist, who was his friend, wonderful man, was there. And I was listening to all these physicists and everybody talk about Sakharov. And I couldn't remember who Sakharov was. I thought he was a Russian, and I feared he was a physicist because I had flunked physics 3 times, beginning physics 3 times in college. And George turned to me and he said, let's have a symposium, and we'll have papers presented, and those papers will go into a book. And Bill, I'd like you to write the first paper. I was so far over my head, but you don't say no to George. I said, yeah, I'll do that. And I spent the next 6 months of my life researching Sakharov and writing that paper. He's been my, it's kind of silly to say I'm in my 80s and he's my mentor. He's been my publicity agent. He's also been a co-conspirator. But most of all, he's been my friend. If I write some essay or something, he'll print copies of it up and hand it out to all kinds of people. And he was a lot of fun. We have a big show in San Francisco called Beach Blanket Babylon with great hats and wonderful satire and et cetera. And George would be on stage with Charlotte performing. I remember talking to an ambassador or a consul general from Ireland, and he said, when Reagan and Shultz came over to Ireland, Reagan went to bed early, as he always did, but Shultz would come over to the pub and sing Irish songs with us at the bar for the evening. He was a lot of fun. He had peripheral vision. He could see a lot of things. I was talking to an engineer from Bechtel. He was head of Bechtel, one of the largest engineering firms in the world. And I said, tell me about George. And he said, you know, George was not an engineer, but he was head of this big engineering company. But that didn't matter because he had an analytic mind, which questioned and put things in scientific order so that you could proceed further. He said also, and this is so George, he said when he was head of the Bechtel Corporation, he made sure that the wives started their own meetings and had their own support system. You know, if your husband in those days, was jerked around to, you know, Saudi Arabia or Siberia or something, and the wives had to just make do, and they had no support. And George made sure that they had support. I'll quit in a minute, but one of the things about George is that he would sit down with the opposition. If you say, well, I'm from this frame of mind and I don't want to have anything to do with those people, George would say, well, let's listen to those people. And let's see if something can get us out of the rut that we're in. And maybe we can find some give and take a little bit so that we can build together instead of just one dominating the other. And I think in his heart of hearts, the reason he liked you or I is because it's so pragmatic. It's so practical. It's not a lot of talk about religion or the divine, etc. It's if you're a believer, can't you get together with other believers and do something practical for your community? Doesn't it come down to practice? And he was a very practical man, and I think I'll quit on that. He was a good golfer. He and I almost won a tournament when he was 90 years old. He was called away on the 12th hole tee box because somebody important in the world had to talk to him at that moment. The other thing, I'll say one more thing and I'll quit. His wife, Charlotte, had cancer early on, and she was in the hospital room, and I went by to see her, and George was there. And Charlotte said, you know, I'm not very religious. My mother was religious, and I don't want to go to my grave without a really lively faith. What can you do to help me have a better faith in God and a better life in that regard? And I said, I tell you what I'll do, Charlotte, I'm going to write you out a rule of life. On a daily basis, you do this, you do that, you do that. And and George piped up and he said, well, why are you doing that for her and not for me? He said, I want a rule of life. I want to have a better relationship with God. You go back to your study and you write one for me. I said, George, I'll do it. And one of the things I said to him was, when you get to church early and you're just sitting there with nothing to do, pick up the hymnal and open it up and don't think about the hymn, the music, just look at the words. The people who wrote that had a theological point of view that they wanted to get across. They had an ecstatic experience of the divine, of the numinous, and they wanted to tell you about it, and it's in those words. Just go study the words. And so he spent the rest of his life studying hymns. So I'll quit now, and because there's a lot of other people here who really I want to hear too.
Thank you so much, Bishop Swing. And I do actually have more questions for you. So you talked so much about George Shultz, the human being, and George Shultz, the friend, and it's honestly just amazing to hear about Secretary Shultz's life in that way. So the next question that I'd like to ask you is, what would you like to say about George Shultz, Secretary of State?
I could talk about, I'll say a word, but there are other people here who could say more and better than I could. as Secretary of State, it depends, I think, on the collegiality between the President and the Secretary of State. And I think George and President Reagan really were quite a team. And what one lacked, the other had. And together, they could make a big difference. I'll just say, I never saw George Shultz cry once in his life, except one time he was talking about Ronald Reagan, and he began to cry. He had such a deep respect. The two of them were kind of like the other side of the same person. So as Secretary of State, I think Reagan was lucky to have him. I think he was lucky to have Reagan, and the world was better for it, and nuclear weapons is better for it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Bishop Swing, for sharing that with us. And it's like truly wonderful. So yes, thank you once again for sharing all of that with us. So with that, I would now like to invite Ambassador Tom Graham to take the floor. Ambassador Graham, I will spotlight your video and then we shall begin. Let's see. You should be able to, yes. So thank you so much, Ambassador Graham, for joining us. And I'd like to start by asking you as well about when you first met Secretary Shultz and how your friendship with him began.
Well, I may have met him in larger groups a couple of times before, but the time when I first really met him and had an opportunity to talk with him was in Geneva, Switzerland. And this was a delegation of which I was a member, of senior members of the government led by Secretary Shultz to try to set the US-Soviet relationship back to one where we could talk with each other. This was after Able Archer 83 and the shoot down of the Korean airliner in 84, and the relationship has gone to zero or close to it. And this meeting was for that purpose. Bud McFarlane was there, Richard Pearl was there, I was there, and a number of others. And we were led by Shultz. And he called the first meeting of our group of, say, 15 people, maybe. And he wanted to talk about missile defense because the President Reagan had recently made his famous speech about the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars, as his critics called it. And he knew that's what was on top of the list for the Soviets. So we had an early morning meeting before the first meeting with the Soviets. And there were about, as I say, about 15 of us in his hotel suite to discuss missile defense. And he was sitting there in his bathrobe. After all, it was early. And we can't get too dressed up this early. And we just had a wonderful conversation. And he and I, after that, often in that time frame, discussed the question of missile defense. And after we returned home with relationships restored and a new process created, he took me to the National Security Council meeting and introduced me to President Reagan as his legal advisor. And I remember President Reagan looked at me and he said, I didn't think the Soviets were interested in law. And Secretary Shultz said, oh, they have a lawyer too. So that's how our relationship began. and it spanned a number of other issues as the years went by in government and afterwards. I was part of the post-Reykjavik meetings in I think 2006 and 2011 and so forth. And so that's how I first came to know him and work with him. He was a remarkable person. And let me interject here how honored I am to have this opportunity to speak about George Shultz at this meeting. I feel very, very honored by this opportunity. And also, Kehkashan, you mentioned something about the middle of the road. And the middle of the road is the place to be. And I just remember in my own experience, I was shepherding a controversial nominee through the Senate to head the Arms Control Agency. His first name was George as well. And he was a retired general who had come out strongly for arms control and moving toward elimination. And so he was attacked by both sides. He was attacked by people who didn't like generals, and he was attacked by people who didn't like arms control. And so we got into Senator Tower's office, if I may mention him, and he knew George Signius was his name. He knew George from way back, and as we walked in, he said, "George, well, you're being attacked from the right and you're being attacked from the left, so you must be exactly where you should be." And I think that's something always to think about. Now, another question you gave to me was opportunity to tell a story or two about George Shultz. And I think some of this audience have probably already heard this story, but it is my favorite one, and I'm going to tell it anyway, in spite of the fact that it may not be new to some people. After Reykjavik ended, and it was such a close-run thing, Mrs. Thatcher was decided to come to the United States. She didn't like it at all, and she was quoted as saying she got on the airplane in London that nuclear weapons have kept the peace in Europe for 40 years, and I'm not about to give them up. And so the Congress also didn't like the Reykjavik discussion much either. And the first couple of days that Secretary Shultz had returned to Washington, he spent that being hammered by congressional committees, just one right after the other. And this was in the middle of his second day of such punishment, and was sitting at his desk for a little rest before going back on the Hill in the afternoon to still some other committee. And his secretary buzzed him and said, "Mr. Secretary, the British Prime Minister is on the phone." And he said, "Well, I guess I'd better take it." So, and I heard all this from him at a meeting at the Reagan Library. And he picked up the phone, and indeed it was Maggie Thatcher on the phone. And she said, "George," she said, "what did you and Ronnie think you were doing there in Reykjavik? I mean, you sounded like you were crazy. You were supposed to be the smart one in the room, and you just lost control. What happened to you?" And on like that at some length. And then she said, "George, I'm at the British Embassy, and I want you over here right now." I want to talk to you right now. And she hung up. And so he buzzed the secretary and said, well, I guess I better go over to the British Embassy. Please, would you please get my car and maybe my so-and-so, one of my principal aides to go with me. So he traveled over to the British Embassy, and as they pulled up in front of the embassy, the British ambassador was out standing in the street. He was so upset about what was going on. And he hurried Secretary Shultz and George Shultz and his aide inside. And as he went into the entrance, there was rooms on the left and right. The door was shut in the room on the right, and the room on the left was a more open lobby type area. And so the ambassador said, both George and his aide started to go into the room. The ambassador said, Mrs. Thatcher is waiting for you in the room on the right. And the two of them started to go in, and the ambassador said, no, I'm sorry, sir, but she wants to see the secretary alone with no one with him. So he goes to the other room, and George opens the door and goes in the room. No one's there. And as you may remember, Mrs. Thatcher carried a huge handbag. I mean, enormous, everywhere. She always had it with her. Very, very large handbag. And so he was standing there waiting, and the door opened on the other side of the room. And in through the door comes Maggie Thatcher, and she shuts the door, and she walks up to George and continues her conversation on the telephone. What did you think you were doing? Nuclear weapons are all that protect us from World War III. You and Ronnie just completely lost it at Reykjavik, and you were there. You were supposed to be the smart one and control things, and you didn't. You failed. What happened to you? And she got so angry, she started hitting George over the head with a handbag, like that. And I don't know how he got out of the room. He stopped the story right there, but somehow he escaped, and without being too damaged by the handbag. But that's an example of world leaders are just people just like everyone else. And Mrs. Thatcher was a particularly vigorous person. What role did he play in disarmament? Well, no one knows for sure who approached who, although the biographers have it that he approached Reagan first after becoming aware of Reagan's aversion to nuclear weapons. And so I believe that it was George Shultz that initially wanted to do something about eliminating nuclear weapons, and he found a companion in view with President Ronald Reagan, and when he said a few things about how nuclear weapons are good for nothing but killing and that sort of thing, and he realized that he might have a chance to move that agenda forward if the Soviets could be engaged. And of course, Gorbachev had made a speech at the United Nations in which he had said that nuclear weapons must eventually be eliminated. It's very important. They threaten us all. So their first meeting in Geneva, the two of them agreed that a nuclear war can never be won and should never be fought. And so that was the opening, and Gorbachev suggested a meeting prior to his visit to Washington to sign the INF Treaty in and or at least discussed the INF Treaty in 1986. I guess it wasn't signed until late '87. And then just he suggested to Shultz that we meet somewhere else, or to Reagan, that we meet somewhere else other than Washington, and then Reykjavik ended up being the place. And all of you know what happened there, but or what nearly happened there. And the prime mover of all that was really George Shultz, although certainly Ronald Reagan had the desire to eliminate nuclear weapons, but George Shultz is the person that actually made it possible to convert these views and commitments into something real. And they came within a very, very narrow space between them and success. And it came down to one word: space. Whether the so-called Star Wars would be tested in space in the first 10 years. And Gorbachev was under direct orders not to agree to that from his government. And so it was toward the end, and Reagan asked for, George, as we all know, had written a short memo to the president just on the spot as to how we could get there and agree to what Gorbachev was proposing, which both were proposing, which was to eliminate all nuclear weapons everywhere and all ballistic missiles that carried nuclear weapons everywhere, that is US and Soviet. And if we did it for ourselves, we'd make sure everybody else did it too. You can be assured of that. And so it looked like they weren't going to get there. It was the last moment. So they had Reagan asked for a short break. And he met with 3 people and off in another room. And he was really committed to this strategic defense initiative because he believed it would work, although there was never a chance that it could. But he believed that it could work. And he didn't want it suppressed by any agreement at Reykjavik. And so he was concerned whether Congress would fund it. And so he asked, the 3 people he was with were Paul Nitze, George Shultz, and Richard Pearl from the Defense Department. And he asked each of the 3, should I accept Gorbachev's proposal to eliminate nuclear weapons and not test this defensive system in space for at least 10 years. And Nitze said, yes, and we'll work out things with the Congress later, and don't worry about it. Shultz said, yes, and I agree with Paul. We'll work it out with the Congress. You don't need to worry about that, Mr. President. I'm sure we can do that. And Pearl said, no, the Congress will never fund it. And Reagan, unfortunately, took Pearl's advice and went back in the room and said, I'm sorry, I can't accept your proposal because of that, because I need to have the capability, authority to test in space. And Gorbachev said something like, you mean everything is not agreed just because of that one word, space? And he said, Reagan said, yes. And then both sides agreed that that was it. And they ended the discussion, they ended the meeting, and Gorbachev said, I don't know if we can keep meeting like this. And Shultz said, well, maybe not, maybe so, something like that. I'm paraphrasing, of course, from the text. I mean, we argue in favor of eliminating nuclear weapons. Well, it was almost done because of George Shultz. And if it's going to happen again, and if there's going to be another chance, it's going to be something like that, I believe, something similar. It's certainly true, as many people have said, that once the two leaders brought this back from Reykjavik, agreed, the bureaucracies in both countries probably would have undermined it and prevented it from happening. But the principle would be established, and then in future years, the goal could be reached. So in my opinion, George Shultz did more, well, certainly as much and maybe more than anyone else to actually achieve the goal of eliminating nuclear weapons. He was a very great man, and we all mourn his passing, but we're all joyful that we had an opportunity to meet him and to know him and to work with him.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ambassador Graham. And that has been truly enlightening about the whole process, that everything that happened during Reykjavik. And also that was quite an anecdote that you shared. So thank you for sharing that with us. I would now like to invite another friend and colleague of Secretary Shultz, Ambassador James Goodby. And I'd like to invite him to share his perspectives with us. So thank you for joining us, Ambassador Goodby. The floor is yours. If you can unmute yourself, please.
Okay, Kehkashan, thank you. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed more than I can say what I've heard from Bill Swing and from Tom Graham. They spoke eloquently about my friend George Shultz, and I'm grateful for that. My relationship, I would say my life with George Shultz began about the same time, I think, as Tom Graham's. I had just come back from a rather unpleasant tour of duty in Geneva, where I was the deputy or vice chair, I think it was called, of the delegation to the talks with the Soviet Union then on nuclear weapons, START it was called. And unpleasant because the head of the delegation and I had very different views about what should be done. And finally there came a time when there was a change in the management of the Arms Control Agency, and the head of our delegation wrote a memorandum which became known as a hit list because he criticized everybody on his delegation, including me, for various reasons. I was too eager for an agreement. The Joint Chiefs of Staff representative was out to lunch and so forth. The only guy that escaped criticism was a man who worked for Richard Pearl. You've already heard something about Richard Pearl, I think. So when I came back, I was looking for another job, basically, and George Shultz swung into action and got me another job. So I've been grateful to him ever since. The job that he got for me was head of a delegation in Stockholm, Sweden, part of what was then called the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, which had produced the Helsinki Final Act in 1975. And those of you who are not familiar with the Helsinki Final Act, I recommend you become familiar with it, because it essentially is the cornerstone for the post-Cold War world in Europe. It was violated in 2014 with the invasion of Ukraine, but something like that will have to be resurrected. Anyway, a fairly important kind of thing in Europe, less known in the United States. The reason I mention that in particular is that George Shultz wanted me to be his representative. He wanted to build me up so that I would have even greater stature than I actually had. And to do that, he decided to have me become a part of the White House team. So here it is. Can you see that picture now?
Yes.
And notice that I am sitting next to President Reagan. And notice that George Shultz is sitting on the couch. That was noted in a recent story in the New York Times, which had to do with the kindness of George Shultz. He decided to place me in the place of honor next to the president, and he himself sat at more of a distance on the couch. And that was very typical of the way George Shultz operated. He would take second place if need be in order to achieve his objectives. And his objective in this case was frankly to build me up, to make me look better so that I would do a better job when I became the head of the delegation. He and I went to Stockholm together, and instead of being sitting in the second row, as usually is the case, he put me in the front row in the place where we were meeting, right beside him. And there's a photograph of the two of us during a time when Andrei Gromyko was speaking. Andrei Gromyko was the foreign minister of the Soviet Union and not a friend of the United States, I think one could say. And the thing that's interesting about the picture is we both had identical expressions on our faces. We were looking rather glum and unhappy about what was being said. So that was my introduction to George Shultz. He helped me throughout the period that I served in that job, which was about 3 years, because it was a job that required me to sometimes take issue with the Pentagon because we were talking about military activities. We were talking about inspection of military activities. We were talking about limitations. We were talking about greater transparency. And some of those things the Pentagon didn't like, and Richard Pearl in particular didn't like. And George defended me. George himself, by the way, was under attack during that all that time from the Pentagon, from Caspar Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense, and from Bill Casey, who was the head of the CIA. They both recommended to President Reagan that he fire George Shultz. I mean, it really was a pretty bloody battle in terms of the way bureaucrats usually behave towards each other or politicians. But if you read the Reagan diary, he wrote an entry in which he said, Cap and Bill have recommended that I fire George Shultz. Why should I do that? He's doing what I want him to do. And because of that, George Shultz was able to protect me. There came a time which again demonstrated another one of his characteristics, which is determination and persistence in trying to achieve goals. He had asked me to stay close to my Russian counterpart, who was a very fine man named Oleg Yunevsky, now deceased, I believe. And so I did stay close to Oleg Yunevsky, and I set up a series of meetings. We had the Stockholm meeting would take a break every so often, and during those breaks, I invited Oleg Granoff to come to Washington, where we would meet with people in other agencies, and to go to Moscow on some other of these breaks. And there came a time when I decided I could not go to a meeting for one of my friends had a family tragedy and couldn't go with me, so I decided to skip that one. I told George Shultz I was planning not to go to Moscow on that occasion. And he said, oh, no, you've got to go. You've got to go. You can't break stride. And you remember those words, break stride, because that's something he often said. Do not break stride. So I went. It was a good thing I did, because it turned out to be one of the breakthrough occasions. In fact, it was the breakthrough occasion. I came back and announced what we had talked about. We hadn't made decisions because NATO had to approve it, but it became known as the GG Compromise, the Goodby-Granoff Compromise. And of course, it led not only to a final agreement, but also to a criticism from the Pentagon that I had exceeded my instructions. And so a letter was sent to the White House saying that terrible things should be done because I had exceeded my instructions. But of course, nothing happened. And why not? Because George Shultz was on my side. He and Reagan wanted this to happen, and it did happen. So just to tell you that I've had a relationship with George Shultz that I will always treasure. My last sight of him via Zoom was just 3 days before he died. We had Zoom meetings every week, usually on Wednesdays and Fridays, almost all during the past year, practically, I think. And at this particular occasion, we had an economist, Holtz-Aitken, I think his name was, Doug Holtz-Aitken. And we had a rather lively discussion about economics. Remember, George was really a professional economist and had done a lot of important work in that field. And so I was rather impressed because Wednesday, he died on Saturday, George was still asking questions and making comments. And one of the in fact, the last thing I heard him say was a joke, the one that he liked so much, because Holtz-Aitken had said, you know, I'm now officially old, so I can have a coronavirus vaccination. And of course, that prompted George Shultz to say, well, in my eyes, Doug, you're a promising young man. And so I laughed, as I always did, at that joke. Well, I'd heard it many times, including said about me. So that was my sort of personal recollections about George. Let me just talk about a couple of things about his characteristics, which I've mentioned one already, the perseverance, determination to achieve his goals, the kindness with which he treated people. I've commented on that. Another feature that he himself wrote about a lot and thought very seriously about is trust. He wrote a quite long essay about his recollections about how trust came to be important in his life. Called Trust is the Coin of the Realm, and most of it was published in the Washington Post not long after his death earlier in this month. It was published. In fact, you can find that on the web. And he said that without trust, it's difficult to achieve much of anything. And that is exactly the way he approached negotiations with the Russians and with the Chinese and others. He tried to build trust. And the thing that I admired mostly about him, he believed in change. He did not see countries as pieces on a chessboard. He believed that the countries were made up of people, that their leaders were people, that they could change, that their systems could change. Incidentally, that was characteristic of the thinking of George Kennan, too, who many years earlier had predicted that if we contained an aggressive Soviet Union, ultimately the system would change. And he was absolutely right. And Secretary Shultz understood that. I don't know how much of a student he was of George Shultz, but the two thought very similarly about change. And lo and behold, because of what George Shultz and Ronald Reagan did, change did occur under the leadership, of course, of Gorbachev. And again, this is contrary to the official opinion of the CIA, which criticized Shultz for being too eager to reach an agreement about things involving the Russians. The CIA did not predict that there would be a fall of the Soviet Union, and it was caused by the fact that George Shultz did understand that it was possible and acted accordingly, and that led to the end of the Cold War. Another thing, you mentioned his practical nature, I think Tom or Bill, one of you. And that's right. He understood how to get things done. For example, on the energy side, I became his executive secretary for an energy task force that he set up at some point during my time out there. I was out there, when I say out there, I mean Stanford. My second tour of duty with him began in 2006 and ended just this year. About 15 years, we worked closely together. And I saw him in many aspects during that long time that of course, I didn't see in the State Department. The relationship was quite different. But in terms of practicality, a man named Tom Steyer, a Democrat who you may have noticed was seeking the Democratic nomination for president a year or so ago, very rich man, hedge fund manager, lived in California. And there came a time during the time I was out there with them when a Texas oil firm introduced, with the help of some politicians in California, a bill that would have rescinded their restraints on emissions, tailpipe emissions from cars. And there was a real danger that the legislature in California at that time would pass it. So lo and behold, George Shultz became a practical politician. And he went around California speaking, campaigning as a politician would, campaigning for the defeat of this legislation that would have abandoned the restrictions on tailpipe emissions. Tom Steyer and he joined together sometimes they didn't, but George Shultz became a regular practical politician. And they carried every county in California. So that bill was defeated. There's a side of George Shultz I would not have imagined, but he was capable of so many things because he was a man for all seasons. Cliche, but that's exactly what he was. One thing I would like to say is that he was in a way a very normal guy. The thing I admired most about him was he was just like anybody else. Frequently, he would invite me and some of the other ladies in the office, a wonderful woman named Susan Schendel, who also died in December, a couple of days before his birthday. He'd invite us to his house on the campus. And we would have a glass of white port, which was his favorite. And we'd have a very nice lunch, which was not prepared by him, but prepared by a cook. At the end of it, he cleared off the table and he washed the dishes. And I don't know many secretaries of state that I've ever seen wash dishes before, but I saw him wash dishes. And so it went. I mean, many other things that I could recount like that made him so extraordinary. He had a conference room near his office at the Hoover Institution. It was a regular museum, but what it was pictures that he liked. One of them had to do with dancing, which he was very fond of. And it showed him with Ginger Rogers. You may remember Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire were notable for the movies that they made about, and always featuring great dancing. And so there was George Shultz dancing with Ginger Rogers, and she had put an autograph at the bottom saying, "When I close my eyes, George, I think that you're like Fred Astaire." And, and of course, obviously, George liked that and put it on his wall. He had a picture of Teddy Kennedy on his wall, too, a Democrat. And what was happening in that picture was that Teddy Kennedy was presenting to George Shultz a crystal tiger after the Princeton Tigers, and it was a farewell gift when George was leaving his job as Secretary of State with a nice inscription. I don't know whether this is what was on it, but I've heard Teddy Kennedy say several times in my presence that George Shultz was unlike most people that he knew in Washington. He showed very little sign of being eager to have another job or a big jobber. He was just doing his job, and that's so typical. Well, I think I have probably gone on long enough. I would just like to say I'm going to miss him.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Goodby, and thank you for sharing all of that with us, and specifically about Secretary Shultz believing in change, and that is a mentality that we all need to have in this day and age. Otherwise, we will stagnate and nothing will happen. So thank you once again for sharing that, as well as the anecdotes with us. And now I would like to move on to our next speaker, Mr. Jonathan Granoff. Jonathan, you have the floor. Let me just find you on the screen. Great. Jonathan, please share your views and reflections with us as well. And if you can unmute yourself, please.
There we go. Am I unmuted now?
Yes, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is an honor to honor a man of virtue. I did not have an appreciation for the accomplishments of George Shultz until 2004. I was invited to participate in the 20th anniversary of the Geneva summit between Presidents Reagan and President Gorbachev. It took place in 2005, but I was invited early on, and I was invited to be a voice of an outsider from the actual summit. So the participants in the summit gathered together there. Secretary Shultz was fed in. He couldn't make it because of his age and so forth. But I immersed myself in the literature of the summit, the preparations, the memos, and I posted a memo of one of the preparatory meetings between Ambassador Shevardnadze and Secretary Shultz that took place at the United States mission to the United Nations. And in that, you see something that is so impressive: the professionalism, the genuine caring, and the mutual and the sense of respect that he evidenced toward his counterparts, who, as you'll recall, at that period in history, the President of the United States was characterizing as an evil empire. But you could see in the memo of this meeting how human and how honest and how clear they were. And as I prepared and immersed myself in so many things that Secretary Shultz was involved in, I came away with a conclusion that I was able to present at this summit with Foreign Minister Besmernik, who was the foreign minister of the Soviet Union at the time, and President Gorbachev and Ambassador Matlock and Bud McFarlane. And it was in 2005, the United States was advancing a currency of fear in the world. In 1985, with Secretary Shultz and Ronald Reagan, there was a currency of possibility and hope. And based on that, there was the building of bridges of trust. And so in preparation for this meeting, I called Pavel Palachenko, who is Gorbachev's very close advisor and translator, and who was present at all of these meetings with Secretary Shultz, President Gorbachev. And he said that he concluded, after seeing many meetings with Shultz and Reagan and Gorbachev, that Shultz was instrumental in building the bridges that ended the Cold War. But most important to him is that he was a fundamentally, a morally guided person who sought vigorously possibilities to build bridges and end hostilities and seek common interests in a very practical, hands-on, get-it-done way. But he was guided by that moral vision. I never expected to discover, as I was studying the characters, the extent to which George Shultz was ahead of his time in addressing the existential threats that face humanity today. His clarity in that. He was one of the first people to write about the need to eliminate methane pollution from oil and gas before the idea of greenhouse gases was a public dialogue. He was instrumental in achieving what Kofi Annan said was it was the most important international agreement ever, the Montreal Protocols that stopped the destruction of the ozone layer. And his accounting of that is very interesting. He spoke with President Reagan about how there was a lot of science behind alerting the public that hydrofluorocarbon molecules coming from refrigerants and air conditioning and sprays and so forth was destroying the ozone layer, which is a protective layer from radiation that our civilization depends upon its health. But of course there was, scientists from the oil industry saying, well, it's not so certain and so forth. And Shultz said, well, we should have an insurance policy. And then he went further, and then he said, and let's actually put a burden on the emissions of carbon. And so he was one of the first advocates for a heavy carbon tax, because he said that business, it's not natural for business to destroy the environment. It's the term he said. And he said, we need a way to make all forms of energy bear the costs and put a tax on pollution. And we're still fighting about that today. But he was instrumental in that incredible diplomatic achievement that has indeed done so much to protect us today. Had that not been achieved, if the Montreal Protocols had not been achieved to protect us from ozone depletion, God knows how many cancers, how many people would die, how much suffering would be inflicted upon humanity. And he doesn't get credit for that, but he identified that. And then if you look at the arc of history of the 20th century, and you see how important that summit was in 1985 in Geneva, where the Soviet Union and the United States, but it's because of the background work, the enormous amount of work, of professional diplomatic work that Secretary Shultz led. They agreed in their final statement of the responsibility that they shared for maintaining peace in the world. And they said a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. This principle of the unacceptability of using nuclear weapons. Recognizing that any conflict between the US and the USSR would have catastrophic consequences, they emphasized the importance of preventing war, and they talked about creating a nuclear risk reduction center. They talked about preventing an arms race in space. And then they ended the statement on security. They will not seek to achieve military superiority. My goodness, what a forward-looking document that was, and how that laid the groundwork for Reykjavik, where Ambassador Graham articulated how close we came almost to eliminating nuclear weapons. But indeed, it changed the relationships between people. It opened up doors of communication for civil society groups. It lowered the fear factor. It built a bridge to a sustainable future, and serves as an example of what people can do when they build the bridge of trust. They talked about getting rid of chemical weapons, which we have done. And that's when they made the commitment to get that done. And George Shultz was instrumental in making all of that happen. And it's because he had that moral compass, and because he had a basic human capacity of building trust. So as I said, in preparation for this, I called President Gorbachev's main advisor and asked his advice about what I might share of that relationship, because it was such an important relationship. Oh, I do want to share one other thing. Secretary Shultz and I went to the same prep school, a very small little prep school in Englewood, New Jersey. And I share an honor with him of being a distinguished alum of that school. And he and I had shared the same headmaster. Marshall Umpleby, and we had wonderful discussions about this, Secretary Shultz and I, that he was reprimanded by him in 1938, and then I was reprimanded by him in 1964. Another meaningful exchange was at a conference at Harvard University, the Belfer Center in 2007, which was full of some of the leaders of the architects of American foreign policy. Max Kampelman, who was very close to both of them, was there, and so there was a discussion with Graham Allison and some of the intellectual leaders of Harvard, and Graham said that the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Missile Treaty, was an important non-proliferation step. And I just interrupted and said, no, I don't think it was a non-proliferation effort. It was the best disarmament effort that they could achieve at the time. It was a disarmament effort. And I think it's very important, of course, to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons, but it's also important to put the disarmament principle front and center. That's the goal. And so there was a debate. And I said, well, we have Secretary Shultz available here, and we have President Gorbachev, and both of them chimed in, yes, it was a disarmament effort. That was our goal. It was the best we could do at the time. And I want to publicly thank Ambassador Graham for being so instrumental in obtaining that, and condemn those who had us pull out of that treaty that had retired an entire class of weapons, making the world so much safer, and putting in motion the build down, substantially putting in motion the build down of the weapons from at least over 60,000 down to the less than 14,000 we have today, and how important that was. And it was a disarmament effort. And that's not to be diminished at all, because that principle of the moral, political, legal unacceptability of nuclear weapons was something that Secretary Shultz championed so powerfully. And Ambassador Graham talked about the incident he had with Margaret Thatcher. And there was one part that Secretary Shultz had recounted that to me. And there was one point, Ambassador Graham, that he said that you couldn't cover everything, but part of it was Margaret Thatcher said, "How could you let him do this?" To which he said, "I agreed with him. That I agreed that we should get rid of them." And that's really important, because he had a moral compass. So I was asked to share the last communication between Secretary Shultz and Mikhail Gorbachev. Mikhail Gorbachev's letter to Secretary Shultz upon his 100th birthday. And I just want to read what Mikhail Gorbachev said to Secretary Shultz. His voice should be here too. Congratulations on your extraordinary jubilee. It's an amazing date. Your life has been a long road, and I might say part of this road we traveled together. Today I look back on those years. They were not easy, but they were very important for the world. We met many times and had many hours of discussions looking for solutions of very complex issues. As we met and talked in Moscow and Washington, then at Stanford and again in Moscow, we also discussed the future, the world in which new generations will live, and we found common ground. The years when we worked together became a turning point in ending the Cold War and the nuclear arms race, in the emergence of trust in relations between our nations. Today, the scale of what was done then looks particularly impressive. I think we can be proud of it. I also want to recognize your work during the subsequent years. I believe it was the continuation of your efforts as Secretary of State. You have been making a compelling case for a world without nuclear weapons. This goal brought the two of us, and Ronald Reagan and me, closer together, even though we saw the path to it differently. The future will see this goal realized. I wish you, dear friend, to continue to be a model of remarkable longevity and intellectual activity to all of us. I wish all the best to all your loved ones. Sincerely, with warmest regards, Mikhail Gorbachev. And I want to wish to the great mystery that gives us hearts that pursue virtue and gives us lives of men who've exemplified love and caring in action and human dignity in their lives. I want to thank the Creator for putting that capacity in our hearts, and pray that we can live with such clarity of moral vision and commitment to building bridges amongst people. I believe that's what human beings are supposed to do in the brief time we're here together. And God bless George Shultz for the good work that he did for all of us.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Johnson, for sharing that with us. And yes, we do have that responsibility now of carrying forward his legacy. So thank you once again. And now I would like to open the floor for questions from the audience. And I would request you that if you do have any questions, please do raise your hand. I had seen one in the chat earlier, but let's see. I do see two raised hands so far. So the first question is from Pragna. You have the floor. Let me just unmute you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kehkashan, and hello, everyone. It is an honor to be a part of this commemoration. My question to you all is, in his book, Turmoil and Triumph, My Years as Secretary of State, Honorable George Shultz talks in detail about Soviet-American arms negotiations, and in particular, its success in ending Cold War. So how did he feel when the US decided to withdraw from the INF Treaty in 2019?
Thank you, Pragna, for your question. We shall take a couple of few questions and then we shall give the floor to our panelists. I had seen earlier that Linda had asked a question that if we were to try again, would Space Force get in the way again? So that is one question from Linda. And I see another raised hand. Erin, you have the floor. Let me just, yes, I have unmuted you.
Thank you, Kehkashan. I read a few articles about Honorable George Shultz recently, and a recurring concept was how he remained calm in the face of adversity, which was actually quite effective because ultimately he was pivotal in ending the Cold War. So looking at our world today, there are a myriad of issues that keep popping up. So following Secretary Shultz's philosophy, how can global leaders adopt similar approaches to maintain peaceful relations with other countries and ultimately embrace a world where everyone coexists?
Thank you, Erin, for your question. And I don't see any other raised hands, but please do feel free to raise your hand. Okay, I do see a raised hand. Joyce, let me just unmute you at Spotlight and unmute. Yes, Joyce, you have the floor.
Yes, I thought of William Pollard often today as we talked. He was a man who lived as priest and scientist. Once he helped with the Manhattan Project the day the bomb was dropped. He said, "My God, what have we done?" Went to the Episcopal Church that night and prayed and stayed. Scientists and priests covered New York Times and covered him. And I just wanted to say that I think as we consider to pursue these concerns from the history and the beauty of George Shultz's life, how can we get a greater dialogue between religion and science and not be afraid of that as if they can't do a great dance and do great work together? So mine was a comment more than and a question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Joyce, panelists, you have the floor. Let me just, yes. Who wants to go first? Yes, Ambassador Goodby. If you can yes.
Yeah, sorry for the delay. I think the best thing I could do is just suggest to each of you that you take a look at the several articles. I think there were at least 8 or 10 of them, that were written by George Shultz, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, and former Senator Sam Nunn. They began writing them in 2007. The last one was written in 2013. They've written a few since, but this series from 2007 to 2013 essentially talked about a world without nuclear weapons, how it could be achieved, how important it was to do it. And I urge you to read it because it's an era that has passed in terms of the human thinking about it. And I say human thinking because obviously people have just forgotten the dangers that nuclear weapons pose. The dangers that led to Hiroshima and Nagasaki have sort of escaped people's minds. We have to be reminded of that somehow. The feelings that George Shultz had about the abandonment of almost all of the agreements that were reached during the Cold War period with the Soviet Union. I can't tell you how distraught he was by it. Of course, he always put in a good soldier, and didn't like to criticize previous administrations or former administrations or present administrations, for that matter. These problems that we face are getting worse, really. We had a long period of time after the Reykjavik summit and the Geneva summit when the world began to think maybe we could get rid of nuclear weapons. 1986 was actually the high point in the possession of nuclear weapons by the world's nuclear weapon states. After that date, they began to go down. But now we are facing an inflection point. I think we, in fact, are beginning to go up again. We're still reducing slightly, but the idea that we'll get rid of nuclear weapons is no longer there. Every country that has nuclear weapons is now planning to keep them for a very long time, and they're making preparations to do so. There's an increasing talk about using nuclear weapons. And I really think we're in a very dangerous place now because we have a situation where we have new technologies that are exacerbating the threat. Cyber tools can be used to create the impression that a nuclear attack came from a place where it didn't come from. So we've got to get busy, I'm afraid, very, very urgently. And I would like to see this administration move a bit more urgently than it is on these nuclear issues. I give them credit for extending the life of the New START Treaty by 5 years, but we've got to make use of those 5 years. We've got also to include North Korea in this, and I think that can be done. So this is what I would think would be most valuable to George Shultz. His legacy should be to continue the effort to rid the world of nuclear weapons. So we need to get on with it, and people need to understand what the threat this really is. I just don't see that happening in the public at large. I'm sorry to go on that way, but I get quite emotional when I think about what George tried to achieve and where people stand now. Thank you.
So true. Thank you, Dr. Goodby, Ambassador Graham, and then Jonathan, and then Bishop Swing.
I agree with everything that Jim Goodby just said. I think he summarized the major issues very, very well and the things that need to be done. I think I would possibly add a test ban to that, because in the end, that's going to be important to the survival of the NPT, as well as some kind of deal in the Middle East to eliminate the nuclear confrontation, if you can call it that, between Israel and Iran. It's not a true confrontation, but it's so far it's a one side has weapons and the other side wants them, but hasn't got them yet. Those hang over the NPT. And I said earlier that I thought that if nuclear weapons ever were eliminated, it would be some process like the one at Reykjavik, but it has to, in order to stick, it has to be broadly embraced by the bureaucracies of both countries. And the only way that's going to happen is to create a situation of cooperation like the world has never known before. And the same thing is required if we're going to save the planet, or at least save civilization from climate change, or global warming, very much in doubt at this point. And so I'm hopeful that the two issues will, over time, force the kind of intense cooperation never before realized, and which certainly does not exist today, to happen and make nuclear weapon elimination eventually possible, and some way of stopping the damage of climate change and solving that problem as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ambassador Graham. Jonathan?
There was a question. Yes. Am I unmuted?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Thank you. There was a question about space, and I think that that's exemplary of the pursuit of states in the pursuit of security to weaponize the entire realm of human endeavor, from the subatomic all the way to the infinite firmaments. That the gift of learning about and manipulating the natural world to be used in the service of pursuing the security of an invention of human beings, the state, such that we pursue security by increasing our capacity to destroy each other. That the very core purpose of the state is to provide security for its citizens. And nuclear weapons and the weaponization of space exemplify a paradox, or an insanity, if you really look at it, which is that the more you perfect the weapon systems, the less security is obtained. Presently, we're at a sort of global pause, a moment of profound reflection on our fragility, our mortality, and our interconnectedness. The current pandemic, as far as anybody has been able to discern, the virus doesn't recognize passports or borders. The climate doesn't recognize passports or borders. The air that we breathe, that depends on the oxygen that we need, depends on the health of the oceans, doesn't recognize borders. The financial system of the world is integrated as a whole. The art community, the science community, all communication, transportation has gone global. In 1985, the bilateral world, or the bipolar world, if you will, was very difficult even to fly planes between normal planes and commerce between Russia and the United States. Today, even in the midst of very negative relations, people fly back and forth, business continues to go on. And yet, as Ambassador Graham pointed out, the bureaucracies of the security establishments of the major countries are still focused on militarism and nationalism, and not thus able to deal with the actual existential threats that we're faced with the climate, with pandemics, with the health of the oceans, and the threat of nuclear weapons, and new technologies, and new weapons in the future, nano weapons, nanotechnologies. Nuclear weapons are 1930s physics, 1940s technology, 1950s technology with the more powerful nuclear weapons of today. But they're basically technologies that were developed decades ago. Science has not stood still. Our ability to destroy ourselves with less money, less people, faster, the science is there. The problem we have is we're driving cars on roads that were set up for horses and buggies. The focus of security only on the nation state rather than our common humanity. So this is time now to have a different paradigm, a different understanding of how security can be obtained. It's exactly where the world was in the middle of the 17th century, when Protestants and Catholics, the people who wanted to reform and were protesting the domination of the Holy Roman Empire and the city-states of Europe. And a third of the population of Central Europe was killed. And in the 1640s, people of good conscience and thoughtfulness got together and said, our political institutions are insufficient to stop this killing. So in 1648, treaties the modern state was created to solve a very pressing problem where people were willing to kill each other in the name of Jesus to an extent that was going to destroy Europe. And we live from the benefit of those very important ideas. And I think we're at a turning point in human history of a similar nature, where our political institutions have to develop a new realism, a realism of our common interests, exactly the points that Secretary Shultz emphasized to break the logjam of the Cold War. Let's identify our common interests. We share the climate, we share the health of the planet, we share the air we breathe. And that's the vision that the United Religions Initiative, which is something that Bishop Swing was the visionary that created, to use the people of faith and moral vision to build those relationships. And that's our task. And it's not a new task. It's always been the task of building bridges amongst people rather than walls.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jonathan. And I will take one more question from Paul. It is about voices. So Paul, you have the floor, and then I shall get back to our panelists.
The question is, what was Secretary Shultz's deepest hope that Voices for a World Without Nuclear Weapons might specifically provide to the nuclear disarmament movement?
Thank you, Paul. And I saw a lot of raised hands from our panelists. So Bishop Swing, would you like to go first, and then we go to our other?
Yeah. We live in a different kind of world now, also because of people in front of their computers who can just spew out all kinds of stuff and gather around people who either believe their point of view or part of their fantasy or conspiracy or whatever. And the isolation of the individual and the divisiveness that's so prevalent in our country and in the world. And when I think of George Shultz, I think of somebody who wanted to make sure we went out and had a conversation with the other. The other is not only up there, the other is over there. And it takes courage to get out of your own bubble and get into the unknown no man's land out there. And because I think one of the lessons that is being taught here is that it gets, big problems get solved by human beings dealing with human beings. It's not just ideology versus ideology, it's also person to person. And so I know George, that was his long suit, and that's what we're about at URI, is to make sure that and not just the people at the top of religions and that sort of thing, but the people at the grassroots have a chance, who are cut off from each other because of all kinds of stuff, have a chance to actually meet each other and work on projects together and grow together. The sinews have to be woven together. You don't wave a magic wand at the top and just say it's all over one way or the other. What you have to do is build up those the infrastructure of human contact and deep appreciation for the other. So, you asked about George. He was into voices because it had to do with the other up there and the other over there. So that's it. There are other hands here. I'd like to hear from too.
Thank you so much, Bishop Swing. And very quickly, I'll give the floor to Ambassador Graham and then Ambassador Goodby. So Ambassador Graham, you have the floor.
Kehkashan, I have to leave in about 15 minutes. So I just wanted to mention that in case I can't reach you when 2 o'clock arrives. But I had a couple of comments on what other panelists had said. And I don't know if that's appropriate at this time. Maybe people want to respond to the question that's just been asked first.
But you can, I am cognizant of time, but in a minute or two, if you can sum up your answer, then that will.
I'll go ahead and make them. First, with respect to Jonathan. Jonathan, you're absolutely correct that I didn't include George Shultz's response. The line went, Maggie Thatcher would say, George, you were supposed to be the smart one in the room. Why didn't you control things? And his response was, but Maggie, I agreed with the president. And her response to that was, well, that doesn't matter. You're still supposed to control the room. And so I always thought that was amusing. Secondly, Jonathan, with your very interesting discussion of science and politics, both are obviously tremendously important, but we all have to remember what Einstein said about the two. He said, and I mean it, remember it, he said that politics is more difficult than science. And it's true, it is. Lastly, I want to comment on something that Jim Goodby said about having the honor of being on the famous hit list of the early Reagan administration. And I was on that same list. I was a colleague of Jim's in that regard. And I've always believed it was an honor, A, to be on the same list with Jim, and B, in particular, to be on that list. And they said about me, I had to be carefully watched. And I've always thought of that list as the equivalent in diplomacy of the enemies list that Nixon had. And several people put it in their CV. Mary McCrory had it listed first among the various organizations she belonged to, member, Nixon enemies list. Well, I feel the same way about the hit list, and it's an honor to be on it with you, Jim.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Graham. And lastly, I give the floor to Ambassador Goodby. You can unmute yourself.
Yep. Yeah, thank you. Well, Tom, thank you for reminding me of that. And as I remember, you were criticized for being a supporter of a Republican senator from Kentucky, which was a no-no according to the hit list. I wanted to just conclude whatever I have to say by pointing out that George Shultz was active in writing to the very last. This book, can you see that, was published just about a month ago. It's called A Hinge of History, and it essentially echoes what Jonathan Granoff was saying, that this is a time of major change in the world, so much so that the whole course of history is up for grabs right now. And unless we make the right decisions, we're going to be in a real pickle. That was George Shultz's last warning to us. I recommend you take a look at the book because it explains why it is that we are passing through this very remarkable time in history. And with that, I think I will close. So thank you very much for everything.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Goodby. And I am cognizant of time. Jonathan, you have 60 seconds. And you're muted.
unmute. Yeah, Ambassador Graham talked about Einstein's, insight that politics is more difficult than science. Albert Einstein, Bertrand Russell, and Joseph Rotblat founded the World Academy of Art and Science, where I'm a fellow. And we just had a big conference that boiled down to a admonition, a manifesto that Einstein, Russell, and Rotblat wrote that ended, it laid out exactly the situation we're in today of this use of science that could bring us such a flourishing global civilization or destroy us. And they ended it with this amazing admonition that it's so clear that George Shultz followed. They ended this beautiful Einstein manifesto, it's called, with remember your humanity, forget the rest. Put that first. And that's precisely what Secretary Shultz did. He put his humanity first and built bridges that no one believed in 1983 or 1984 were possible, and accomplished it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jonathan. And thank you so much, everyone. This was indeed the most engaging and captivating webinar that I've been a part of in a long time. And I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say that Secretary Shultz was larger than life. And, let us take inspiration from the life work of Secretary Shultz and take to fruition the work that he so ambitiously embarked upon of creating a world free of nuclear weapons and of addressing the threat of climate change, both, as he had emphatically stated on many occasions, as posing the greatest danger to the survival of our world. And it's this dream of his that we have the responsibility of fulfilling. Secretary Shultz, we will truly miss you. But my deepest gratitude to Bishop Swing, Ambassador Graham, Ambassador Goodby, and Jonathan Granoff for supporting our efforts in bringing this panel together, and a huge vote of thanks to our audience for your engagement. Thank you once again for joining us today. Please stay safe and take very good care of your loved ones and yourselves. Have a wonderful weekend and goodbye. Thank you, everyone.